As a reader, when I start reading a prologue, I'm usually impatient to get to chapter 1. But by the end of a good prologue, I'm wondering about the subsequent story and excited to see how the event fits into the rest of the plot. Meg Latour.
You're listening to Writing Roots, brought to you by Aspen House Publishing.
Welcome to Writing Roots. I'm Lee Hull.
And I'm Lee Esses. Today's topic is one that we have actually had an episode on, saying, prologues, avoid them at all costs. That is the rule, and today we're telling you how to break it.
For the record, prologues are things in fiction, so we are not talking about introductions or forewords or anything like that, which are for nonfiction. We are talking about prologues, which are, by definition, a story before the story starts. This is why we say to avoid prologues, because most of the time, the prologue should just be chapter 1.
In the quote, there's a great thing saying, when I start reading a prologue, I'm impatient to get to chapter 1. I want to actually start the book. So often when readers are approaching a prologue, we're asking ourselves why this is important and more or less dismissing it because it's not the story that I came here to read.
Most of the time, a poorly written prologue is there because the author wants it, not because the reader needs it. It is an opportunity for the author to lore dump or give us the character's backstory when we don't need their backstory or anything like that. That is why the rule to avoid them exists, because too often they're bad prologues.
They're not relevant to the story, and readers end up approaching the rest of the story wondering how this ties in. If it's not immediately apparent, but you need the reader to know all of this lore about the gods that were buried here 30,000 years ago that never show up in your story, this might be an indicator to release this as a separate blog post. As a promotion for this book coming up, you do not release it within the book.
If you go too far back, the main character doesn't actually care. So if you are going 2,500 years before your main character, and you just start rambling about Proto-Germanic matriarchal cultures, there's a problem.
Unless your character is somehow experiencing this information at some point, they are doing research for a research paper and it ends up being relevant to solving the problem, we don't care. It's cool that you have this amount of backstory. I love that you are writing selfishly. Hold off.
Prologues are often also used incorrectly in that they are way too long and immediately makes the reader regret reading it. They want to skip over it. I actually ran into this one. It wasn't a very long one, but it was a very boring prologue. I skipped it after about a half a page. I never skip prologues. Never. Except for this one.
And let's say this is the first time you'd ever heard of this author. Would you have even moved on to chapter 1?
So here's the thing. It was the first time I've ever heard of this author. I did move on to chapter 1. I did not make it past page 5.
The prologue is an indicator to your readers the type of story that you're telling, the type of floral language that you want to do. If you are just info dumping, then a reader who has never heard of you or never read you before is going to look at that and go, I don't want to spend a whole book reading this. Even if the style is vastly different than the rest of the book, it's going to work against you more often than it's going to work for you. So, what are audience expectations for a prologue?
Most importantly, it needs to connect to the story. There needs to be a purpose for it existing to tell the story, without it actually being a chapter 1 in disguise.
Oftentimes, what the writer thinks is a prologue is actually a chapter 1 of this is when my main character was a kid or when this and that happened. If it includes your main character, it's chapter 1. If it's going to show the zombie apocalypse and then the rest of the story is surviving the zombie apocalypse, that's a chapter 1.
I could make an argument for that one being a prologue if your main character is not directly involved.
Another audience expectation is whatever flavor, whatever tone, whatever vibe you're setting for the prologue will set the tone for the rest of the book. As readers, this is our first taste of you actually telling a story, so just get to the story.
Not only does it give a taste of your style, your writing, it should give us some kind of flavor at the world. It should give us some kind of interest in the characters and the conflict, especially what's going to happen with the conflict. It should hint at what is coming without actually spoiling anything. And here's the key piece, without info dumping.
Even the best well-written prologues can drive me batty because these characters in the prologue never show up again. I like it, I've enjoyed it, and then I'm invested in these characters and I keep waiting for them to come back and they never do. It's distracting for the reader if it's not plot relevant throughout the story.
So while the rule is to avoid prologues, and we do encourage you, especially if you are newer, to still avoid prologues, here is how you can break this particular rule in a way that still serves your story. Point number 1, make sure you don't take the main character's point of view. The prologue is not the main character's point of view.
It should be a completely different character's point of view and a very short version of the story. Often this is used to introduce us to the world, but fingers crossed, not in an info dumpy way. If the plot of the story is your main character returns from the military and puts together a vigilante group and takes out these mercenaries in Africa. The mercenaries doing mercenary evil things for a prologue might be able to pull that off because you're establishing the bad guy and you don't have your main character in that. They're not here to make an impression. If the character is being a victim of, then it's a chapter 1.
So my favorite prologues ever are from Stormlight Archive because across all of the books, he goes back to the same night, the same world-changing night that sets off the events for the rest of the books. So he follows the very first rule of don't take the main character's point of view. We don't take the main character's point of view in any of these prologues. We take a side character's point of view as they experience this night where the king is assassinated. In the first one, we see it from the assassin's point of view. In the second one, we see it from the king's daughter's point of view. In the fourth one, because I don't remember the third one, we see it from the king's wife's point of view. So we get this very different perspective in each of these prologues, even though it's covering the same event. And that is something that you can do with your prologue, is connect it with other books in the series.
This is especially interesting if your series is based around a world instead of a certain character. So the Marvel Cinematic Universe style. If there's a character that was a side character way over here in this first book, and then the fourth book in the series, you reference them and they become a main character, you can have the prologue kind of connect those dots, but have a disclaimer in there going, if you haven't read book 1, skip the prologue, it's not for you.
Another piece of breaking the rule that goes really well with not info dumping about your world is making sure that whatever you are telling in the prologue is very connected to the plot of your upcoming story, not to the world itself. In Lord of the Rings, in the movies, we see the prologue of the initial battle against Sauron and Narsil being broken and all of that to set us up to understand the rest of the story.
The prologue in Lord of the Rings connects us to the problem of the plot. The ring needing to be destroyed. Why this ring is an issue. It's not just cursed jewelry. It's the fate of the entirety of Middle-earth.
It's the one ring to rule them all.
If the prologue was about the elves and why the elves hate dwarves, we would immediately be asleep before the movie even started, before we even started reading the books. Connect it to the plot more than the world.
And obviously, you can show us some of the world as you're doing this. The Lord of the Rings did this by showing us elves and humans fighting with each other, and we saw elements of the world and how it operates and how they cooperate or don't cooperate. But it wasn't focused on that. It used plot-relevant information to give us a look at the world.
The pre-movie scrolls on Star Wars are kind of a hit and miss as far as if they work as a prologue or not. For the most part, they don't, because they tell us things that we already learn later on. But it is an interesting way to set the scene in a world that we've never been in, because it's connecting to the themes of the story. The themes of the good Jedi versus the evil Sith. So we aren't going, maybe I should be on Vader's side. The prologue sets the tone that carries through the rest of the story.
If you are going to write a prologue, write it last. This will help you avoid info dumping just because you're excited about the world. This will help you avoid accidentally writing what should be just chapter 1. If you write your prologue last, you will have a better understanding of your entire story and what actually needs to be told to set the reader up to understand it and to follow all of the events. Most stories don't need a prologue. So really take a look at your story, whether it needs a prologue to be told well, and then
write selfishly.
If you have a question or comment for our hosts or a topic you'd like us to cover, send us an email at writingroots@aspenhousepublishing.com or find us on Facebook by searching for Aspen House Publishing.